Okay, now with the Passover rapidly approaching, what I'd like to do today is look at a vexing problem for biblical scholars where the place in archaeological history where we would expect to find evidence for one of the greatest Bible stories of all, the Exodus, is showing up no support whatsoever, according to the conventional chronology adopted by Egyptology. Now, when Jesus said that we are to love God with all our heart, mind and soul, the use of the word mind implies that our faith in God and his word is not to be a blind faith where we believe without evidence, or worse, believe when the evidence contradicts what we have faith in. Now, if the Bible is true, where is the evidence for the Exodus? Or is the Bible's account a myth, a lie, as archaeologists claim? Now, before we can look at what evidence there might be, I want to give you some background information by giving you a very basic overview of Egypt's history. Now, Egypt's history is broken up into several periods. Now, the earliest of these periods is called the Old Kingdom, the time when Egyptologists tell us that most of the great pyramids were built. And the Old Kingdom consists of dynasties 1 through to 6. Now, the next great period of native Egyptian rule was the Middle Kingdom, consisting of dynasties 12 and 13. Now, Egyptologists believe that the Middle Kingdom fell around 1750 BC, after which a foreign people called the Hyksos ruled Egypt. Now, after the Hyksos were expelled, a couple of centuries later, according to the conventional scheme, came Egypt's greatest period of time, her golden age, when she was at her peak, the New Kingdom, consisting of dynasties 18, 19 and 20. Now, one of the last rulers of the mighty 18th dynasty was a very famous king, King Tutankhamun, whose fabulous treasure we all know about. Now, during the next dynasty, the 19th dynasty, ruled that other very well-known pharaoh that we know as Ramses the Great. Now, following each of these three great periods of Egyptian rule were dark periods of mostly foreign rule. Now, each of these great periods of Egyptian rule were a part of what's called the Bronze Age, which came before the Iron Age. Now, the Bronze Age is basically broken up into three major parts, and these roughly match these three great periods of native Egyptian rule that we've looked at here. Now, the Old Kingdom ruled during the early Bronze Age, the Middle Kingdom ruled during the Middle Bronze Age, and the New Kingdom ruled during the Late Bronze Age. Now, today our focus is going to be on two of these periods of time, the Middle Bronze Age, which included dynasties 12 and 13, and the Late Bronze Age, which included dynasties 18 and 19, when Egypt was at her peak. And that's the time period where the Exodus is usually placed. Now, there are two dates that are usually put forward by Bible scholars for the Exodus. Now, the first date is around 1450 BC, which was the middle of the 18th dynasty, according to Egyptologists. Now, the second date is 1250 BC, which is during the reign of Ramses the Great of the 19th dynasty, according to Egyptologists. Now, the reason for these different dates comes from different interpretations of two Bible verses. Now, 1 Kings 6:1 says that the Exodus occurred 480 years before Solomon's temple was built, which gives us a biblical date of around 1450 BC. Now, this date falls in the middle of the 18th dynasty, according to Egyptologists. Now, in Exodus chapter 1, verse 11, it says that the Israelites built these store cities or garrison cities of Pithom and Ramesses. Now, the city of PI-RAMESSE in the Delta is usually associated with this city of Ramses. Now, since the city was built during the reign of Ramses the Great and did not exist in the 18th dynasty, many Bible scholars and archaeologists place the Exodus at a later date of around 1250 BC during the 19th dynasty, when Ramses the Great ruled according to the conventional scheme. Now, according to Egyptology, both of these dates fall in the middle of the period known as the Late Bronze Age. So I want you to bear that in your mind, that the time period when the Exodus is usually placed is the Late Bronze Age, which is the time of the 18th and 19th dynasties, according to the conventional scheme. Now let's look at what evidence there is for the Exodus during the 18th dynasty. Now, the clear biblical date of around 1450 BC for the Exodus was the time when Thutmose III ruled Egypt according to the conventional scheme. Now, according to the Bible, the time of the Exodus was a time of phenomenal destruction in Egypt. Now, what do we find in the reign of Ramses III? Well, we find the complete opposite. Thutmose III was the greatest conqueror in Egypt's history, and he expanded Egypt to its greatest size as far north as the Euphrates River. Now, Egypt held some degree of control of this area for about 150 years or more after the reign of Thutmose III, not continuously or in the sense of a military occupation, but as a tributary. So it would be open to reconquest by Egypt when an annual tribute was not paid. Now, the Bible is absolutely silent when it comes to any conflict between any of the judges and the Egyptians. Israel was repeatedly oppressed by neighbouring peoples during this time, but never is Egypt mentioned in the book of Judges. Now, there are a large number of scriptures that have been discovered from the reign of Thutmose III, but there is not the slightest hint of any severe economic or political crisis at this time. It was a time of unparalleled prosperity. The coffers of Egypt were filled to the brim with the booty of numerous successful wars and the tribute and loot of conquered peoples. And the prosperity to which Egypt rose in its golden age under Thutmose III continued unabated into the reign of his successor, AMENHOTEP II. Now, the other pharaoh from the 18th dynasty, often associated with being the pharaoh at the time of the Exodus, is Thutmose III's successor, AMENHOTEP II. Now, some of you may remember the Old Good News article pictured here, written by Keith Stump during the Worldwide Church of God days, presumably based on the research of Dr. Herman Haib, who was the church's go-to man at the time on history. Now, this article was written in 1988, and it portrays AMENHOTEP II as the pharaoh at the time of the Exodus. Now, the dates given for his reign in the article do not match the current dates used by Egyptologists, but reflect much older dates that they used. Now, I'd like you to notice in the article the picture in the bottom right of a coffin with AMENHOTEP II's mummy in. Now, I'd like you to have a think about that and think, well, what might be wrong with that if he was the pharaoh of the Exodus? We'll come back to that in a little while. Now, according to the AMENHOTEP II Exodus theory, Hatshepsut, who reigned a couple of pharaohs beforehand, was the daughter of Pharaoh who adopted Moses. Now, she took over as regent when her brother died, while his son, Thutmose III, was still only a very young child. Now, she didn't stay regent, but took the extraordinary step of assuming the kingship and becoming a full pharaoh, perhaps because of her lack of trust in Thutmose III, and perhaps because of the loss of Moses, who she may have been grooming to become pharaoh, according to the theory. Now, AMENHOTEP II became pharaoh after Thutmose III died, and according to the theory, that was shortly before the Exodus. Now, he had no campaigns into Syria and Palestine in his last 20 years of rule, and this, according to the theory, is because of the destruction of the plagues of Egypt. Now, Thutmose IV is not the firstborn son because, according to the theory, AMENHOTEP II's firstborn son died in the last plague. Now, there's a relatively new piece of archaeological evidence that gives us the latest place in Egypt's timeline for the time of the Exodus. It's called the Berlin Pedestal, and it's been dated to around the time of the middle of the 18th dynasty. Now, as you can see here, it's got 3 name rings of subdued peoples, the names of Ashkelon, Canaan, and Israel. Now this evidence shows that Israel was already formed as a nation in the land when this was carved. And based on the style of writing, it has been dated somewhere around the middle of the 18th dynasty, between the reigns of Amenhotep II and Amenhotep III. Now this inscription has to be carved at least 50 years after the Exodus to factor in both the 40 years of wilderness wandering and the conquest of the land. Now there are a couple of other things that also work against the view that the Exodus was during the 18th dynasty. Now first of all, the 18th dynasty pharaohs all ruled from Thebes way down in southern Egypt, not near the delta where the Israelites were as implied in the account of the Exodus. Now the second thing is that there has been no major 18th dynasty construction works ever uncovered so far in the delta region. Now Exodus 1 verse 11 tells us that the Israelites built garrison cities for the pharaoh, presumably near where they were in the delta. Okay, now let's now look at what evidence there might be for a 19th dynasty Exodus. Now Exodus 1 verse 11 is used as support for a 19th dynasty Exodus, since the city of PI-RAMESSES wasn't built until the reign of Ramses the Great. Now how valid is this interpretation? Well, David Roll, an author of A Test of Time, believes that this statement is what is known as an editorial redaction. Now let's look at a clear editorial redaction in the book of Genesis to better understand this point. Now in Genesis 14 verse 14, it says that Abram pursued the kings who had taken Lot and others captive as far as Dan on the way north to Damascus. Now not only was the city of Dan in northern Israel not there or called by that name in the time of Abraham, neither was it called by that name when Moses compiled the book of Genesis. Now this is one reason why many scholars believe that the Torah was a much later creation than the time of Moses. Now, to better understand that, the widely accepted Jewish view of the Old Testament books is that they were canonized by the scribe Ezra many centuries later. And in the process, he made a number of minor editorial notes, such as adding in updated place names to help readers in his day better understand where earlier events took place, and hence the insertion of the name Dan here in Genesis. Now the same can just as easily apply to the name Ramses in Exodus 1 verse 11. Now there may have been an earlier settlement in the general area of the later city of Ramses, and the name of Ramses may have been later added in. Now we'll look at that earlier settlement a little bit later on. Now another problem with a 19th dynasty Exodus is how that later date of 1250 BC doesn't allow sufficient time for all of the judges. Now in the time of Jephthah, the judge Jephthah, Israel had been in the land for at least 300 years. Yet there is only 200 years between the reign of Ramses the Great and King Saul's reign, and one also has to allow the 40 years of wilderness wandering as well. And we saw before the Berlin pedestal that is dated somewhere in the mid-18th dynasty that shows Israel was already established as a nation in the land. Now the Israel stela of Ramses the Great's successor Meneptah also shows the same thing. It says that Israel is desolated, his seed is no more. Now, I asked you to think about what might be wrong with seeing a photo of Amenhotep II's coffin and mummy if he was the pharaoh of the Exodus. Well, maybe you thought, hang on a minute, didn't the pharaoh drown in the sea? How is it that we have his mummy? Well, not so according to the article. In that article we read, contrary to the common notion about the pharaoh of the Exodus, Amenhotep II did not drown in the Red Sea with his army. Oh? The article says, read Exodus 14 carefully. Well, let's look at that passage and a couple of others and see if that is true or not. Now in Exodus 14 verse 4, God clearly says that the Pharaoh himself, not just his army, will pursue the Israelites. And Exodus 14:28 says, all the army went in and not one of them survived. And that's repeated in Psalm 106. And Exodus 15:19 says that the horse, singular, of Pharaoh went in. Now that's what it says in the King James Version. Now the New King James Version says horses plural. Now the Hebrew, in fairness, can be translated both ways. Now that said, these verses put together leave little room for the view that any Egyptian, not even the Pharaoh himself, survived the Red Sea crossing, despite the fact that Yul-Brynner made it back in the Ten Commandments. Now the only reason that Yul-Brynner made it back to Egypt in the Ten Commandments is because Cecil B. DeMille knew that we had the mummy of Ramses the Great, and that is with us today. And here he is on the right hand side here, along with the mummies of our other two candidates that we've looked at so far from the 18th dynasty, Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. Now in fact we have all the mummies of the pharaohs from the 18th and 19th dynasties. Now in light of the scriptures we've just looked at, it is becoming increasingly difficult to justify placing the Exodus during the late Bronze Age. Now the evidence from Egypt very strongly is against it, and it gets even worse when we go to the land of Israel and look at what evidence there is for a conquest during the late Bronze Age. Now when Kathleen, Kenyon and her British team of archaeologists excavated Jericho in the 1950s, they expected to find, if there was evidence for a destruction in Joshua's time, that it would be found to date to the late Bronze Age, which is the period contemporary with Egypt's Golden Age, the 18th and 19th dynasties. Now what Kenyon found was that Jericho was not destroyed during the late Bronze Age, but was destroyed at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Now her excavations found that there was simply no late Bronze Age city at Jericho for Joshua to have conquered. And following those findings, a massive wave of skepticism of the historical accuracy of the account of the Exodus and other biblical events swept across the whole world. Now many places specifically mentioned in the Bible have been excavated, such as Jericho, Hebron and Gibeon, and no evidence for a city in the late Bronze Age, that is the time of Egypt's 18th and 19th dynasties, has ever been found. And this problem is systemic right across the land of Israel. Now those sites, including Jericho and many other sites throughout Palestine, were inhabited during the Middle Bronze Age, the time of Egypt's Middle Kingdom. And all were city walls as the Bible described. And they were all described at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. And as can be seen in the table shown here, most of these cities were not inhabited during the late Bronze Age. So the problem that archaeologists have with believing the Bible's account of the Exodus using either of the two dates put forward is twofold. First, both of the 18th and 19th dynasties are very well documented, and there is not the slightest hint of any great catastrophe impacting Egypt at either time. As I mentioned, this is the period known as Egypt's Golden Age, not one of the collapse of the Egyptian civilization. And second, many of the cities that the Bible tells us were conquered and destroyed in Palestine by the Israelites were not occupied during the late Bronze Age, such as Jericho and others. Many of them no longer existed following the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Now, the Bible's account appears to contradict the evidence found by archaeology. Can we trust the Bible's account or not? Or is there something else at work here that can harmonise the Bible's history with the archaeological record? Did the Exodus occur during the 18th or 19th dynasties? Or is there another possibility? Are scholars perhaps looking for the Exodus in the wrong place in time? Now, I recently finished listening to an audio series of old lectures from Richard Page's Ambassador College course, Archaeology and History. Now, he spent quite a few lectures covering the Exodus, and he presents the evidence in a very open-minded and fair way. Now, he was very open-minded about the seemingly insurmountable problems both in Egypt and the land of Israel for a late Bronze Age exodus. Now, the series was recorded in 1987, the year before the article we looked at before. And at the very end of it, he very briefly mentioned that it is because of these reasons we are now looking into the work of a British scholar named John Bimson, who has been suggesting a Middle Bronze Age exodus. Now, Richard Page implied he would go further into it in another lecture, but unfortunately he never did. Now, John Bimson may be familiar to some of you here who have seen the recent documentary film Patterns of Evidence. Now, he is the author of Redating the Exodus and Conquest, which I presume is the book that Richard Page was referring to. Now, John Bimson is one of several scholars following in the footsteps of the man who first popularised the view that the Exodus occurred during the Middle Bronze Age. Now, I mentioned how in the 1950s, Kathleen Kenyon excavated Jericho and came to the conclusion that there was no late Bronze Age city for Joshua to conquer, after which a massive wave of scepticism spread across the academic world regarding the accuracy of the Exodus and other Bible stories. Ironically, around the same time, a scholar arose who challenged the foundations of Egyptian chronology and called for a radical change to dates assigned to Egypt's dynasties. Now, that revisionist pioneer was Emanuel Velikovsky, and the book that began the revisionist movement was Ages of Chaos, that was first published in 1953. Now, during his research, he came upon a document called the IPUWER Papyrus, dated to the end of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, which describes devastating plagues eerily similar to what's told us in the Bible about the plagues of Egypt. Now, seeing the archaeological problems with placing the Exodus during the late Bronze Age, he was the first scholar to popularise the belief that the Exodus occurred during the Middle Bronze Age, as has been further promoted in the recent Tim Mahoney documentary, Patterns of Evidence. Now, before we look at the evidence for a Middle Bronze Age exodus, we need to understand just how the foundations of the Egyptian system of dating pharaohs was developed. Now, how can we be sure of the dating methods used by Egyptologists? How was the system of BC dates that archaeologists use today for Egypt's dynasties developed in the first place? Now, David Roll, in his book A Test of Time, makes these comments. He says, "What happens when we need to fix an event which occurred before Christ's birth in absolute time? What methods do scholars employ to determine exactly how many years have elapsed since Pharaoh Ramses II fought his heroic battle at Kadesh?" Well, the answer in its crudest form is that historians simply add up the sequence of regnal years, that is the number of years that each king reigned, backwards from the birth of Christ to the event that they wish to date. History is, however, never so simple, for there are many other factors which have to be taken into account. Factors such as co-regencies, parallel dynasties, and interregna. In essence, however, the methodology is to add up the intervening reign lengths between two events and apply certain other well-established historical cross-links, what we call synchronisms, between different ancient civilizations in order to construct a chronological framework upon which we can embroider the events of history. Now, if mistakes have been made in the reconstruction of that framework, then the edifice of pre-Christian history would be something similar to a Hollywood film set, an artificial construct with only a superficial integrity, end of quote. Now, to assist with dating before 700 BC, there is a major synchronism with the Bible that has effectively become the great anchor point for Egyptian chronology, with the number of years ruled by each pharaoh used to flesh out the reigns of Egyptian kings from either side of it. Now, this key synchronism with the Bible was established by Champollion, the Frenchman who deciphered the Rosetta Stone. Now, on the outside of the Temple of Karnak in Thebes is a relief of Palestinian cities paying tribute to the 22nd dynasty king, SHISHAK I. Now, Champollion, in his excitement, saw the similarity of the name of Shoshenq with the pharaoh that the Bible calls Shishak, who plundered the temple soon after the death of Solomon around 925 BC. And that synchronism, based purely on a similarity of name, has stuck ever since. Now, if you look at the map on the right-hand side here, upon closer examination, the cities paying tribute are from northern Israel, not from Judah, which is the complete reverse of the account of Shishak's conquest, as it was Judah and her fortified cities, not Israel, that was conquered. Now, if you remember, Jeroboam was an ally of Shishak, as he was in Egypt shortly before Solomon died. Now, ironically, the chronology that is now causing so many to have doubts about the Bible's history was constructed around this major synchronism by archaeologists who are actually over-eager to find evidence supporting the Bible. Now, David Roll, in a presentation that he did, shows how this is a classic example of a circular argument. Now, Egyptologists use the Bible to date the 22nd dynasty and work back with the reign links of kings to come up with dates for the 18th and 19th dynasties. And when they can't find evidence for the Exodus in that time, they then reject the Bible, which was used to establish those dates in the first place. Circular reasoning at its best. Now, Egyptian data can be cross-checked with some confidence against Greek, Babylonian and Assyrian data back to around 700 BC. But before that, Egypt's chronology for the most part stands alone in supplying absolute BC dates that archaeology uses to assign dates to finds across the entire ancient world. Now, if the dates of the dynasties of Egypt before 700 BC are incorrect, these wrong dates then affect the dates of artifacts found throughout the rest of the ancient world. Now, strangely, before 700 BC, by using Egyptian data as the only cross-reference, there are these mysterious Dark Age gaps where absolutely nothing is recorded for centuries between 1200 and 700 BC, or 750 to be precise, in Greece, Turkey, and many other places. In the case of the Greek Dark Age, there is literally nothing that can be dated for a period of nearly 5 centuries. But something must be up. That's the case. Now, we mentioned to you Shoshenq the first relief on the outside of the wall of Karnak. Now, inside the temple of Karnak, there is another relief from Thutmose III, who we spoke about before. His reign is usually placed at the time of the Exodus. Now, the evidence in this relief actually makes a better case for him not being the pharaoh of the Exodus, but actually the Shishak of the Bible. Now, as you can see here in the relief on the right-hand side there, display in 10 rows, the top 5 all being gold, what appears to be the legendary wealth of Solomon's golden age, including vessels and utensils of the temple, the golden altar, the brazen altar, the showbread, both gold and silver, and all the candlesticks. Now, if all the pharaoh's booty had been painted on this wall, it quite literally would have been a mile long. But instead, numerical symbols were marked beneath each picture to illustrate the quantity. Now, some examples of the temple booty on this relief include an exact match of 100 basins of gold and 300 basins of gold, 300 shields of gold, to what was in the temple according to the Bible. And this argues very strongly in favour of the items being one and the same as the treasure taken by Shishak from the temple of Jerusalem. Now, according to Egyptologists, the middle of the 18th dynasty is dated to 1450 BC at the time of the Exodus. Yet the evidence of Thutmose III's relief at Karnak suggests that the middle of the 18th dynasty may have actually been the same time as King Solomon and his son Rehoboam. So, if the new kingdom that ruled in the late Bronze Age was around the same time as Solomon, then this would suggest that the Exodus occurred not in the late Bronze Age, but actually earlier in the Middle Bronze Age during the Middle Kingdom. Now, since archaeologists say there is no evidence for the Exodus in the late Bronze Age, can we find evidence for Israel being in Egypt and the Exodus occurring earlier in the Middle Bronze Age, where KATHLEEN KENYON placed the destruction of Jericho. Now, during the Middle Kingdom, archaeologists have found that the eastern Nile Delta was heavily populated by Semitics, whose numbers swelled at the time. Now, here is a tomb painting at Beni Hassan showing Semites migrating to Egypt. Now, Exodus 1:11 says that the Israelites built Ramses, which is believed to be PI-RAMESSES, built during the 19th dynasty in the reign of Ramses the Great. Now, underneath the 19th dynasty city of PI-RAMESSES, Manfred Bitak uncovered a much older city. Now, today the site is called Tel El Daba, and Bitak has identified this as the ancient city of Avaris. Now, its archaeology spans two periods of time. Now, the older levels show that it was dated to the time of the Middle Kingdom. Now, apart from a royal precinct, the site was predominantly settled by Semites. Now, the Semites of the earlier period were prosperous to begin with, but it seems apparent from the archaeology that towards the latter part of their time there, that they became impoverished. Now, after the Semitics left the site, it was then occupied by the Hyksos, foreign invaders from the east. Now, Avaris was populated by around 30,000 people. Now, John Bempson in the documentary Patterns of Evidence notes that there is evidence of many more of these Asiatic settlements nearby, at least 20 or 30 sites, little of which has been excavated on any great scale so far. Now, based on drill samples right across the area, they have been able to determine the course of the branch of the Nile that went through the area during the Middle Kingdom. Now, note at the top of the map the location of the 12th dynasty palace. Now, from the Semitic settlement, I have traced in blue, as you can see there, the path of the downstream current to the 12th dynasty palace. So you can almost imagine that this possibly being the path that Moses' basket took to the daughter of Pharaoh while she was bathing. Now, in the bottom right there, you can see some beautiful bronze daggers found in the Semitic settlement whose style has been traced back to the land of Canaan. Now, notice too on the map the location is what is believed to have been the palace of the Pharaoh's vizier. Now, speaking of that palace, one remarkable structure that was excavated at Avaris was a palace that had 12 colonnades as well as 12 tombs within its grounds. Now, one of those tombs was particularly unusual. It was pyramid shaped. And in this Semitic dignitary's tomb, there was no trace of bones that were found of this particular individual. Now, grave robbers don't steal bones, so it seems that the body was removed, not stolen. Now, some scholars, such as David Roll, believe that this was, in fact, the tomb of Joseph. Now, in it was also found a large broken statue that would have stood twice the height of a normal man. Now, the statue was of a Semitic man with red hair and a coat of red, blue, and gold. Now, I find the colours on his coat quite intriguing. They are the same colours as today's British royalty, which fits in very well with our understanding that Joseph's descendants became the English-speaking nations of Britain and America. Now, another proof of the Israelites being in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom is that during the 12th dynasty in the Middle Kingdom, a long 200-mile canal was built parallel to the Nile River that greatly increased the amount of land able to be cultivated, as well as siphoning off excess floodwaters. Now, to this day, it is known as the Bar Yosef, which in English means the Canal of Joseph. Now, in one Egyptian papyrus called the Brooklyn Papyrus, it records a slave list with names that seem to come straight out of the Bible, such as Asher, Issachar, Menahem, and Shifra. And it's also noted that there was a disproportionately higher number of female slaves in this list. Now, archaeology reports indicate that during the latter part of the Semitic time at Avaris, that there was an exceptionally high mortality rate amongst babies in their first year, and this was disproportionately higher amongst the males. Now, some way south of Cairo, with most near the great lake called the Fayum, are the many mud brick pyramids of the Middle Kingdom. Now, near these is a Middle Bronze Age town called Kahun, which is an interesting name because the name Kahun is Hebrew for priest. Now, it was an enclosed walled town with mostly Semites. Now, Josephus wrote that the Israelites were involved in building pyramids when in Egypt. Now, some might argue from that it could be the pyramids of Giza and so forth, but it's far more likely that they were involved with building these lesser pyramids of the Middle Kingdom, as it was only these pyramids that were built with mud brick and straw, the same materials noted in the Bible that were being used by the Israelites for building during their slavery. Now, one of these mud brick pyramids is actually right next to that town of Kahun. Archaeologist Rosalie David wrote the following about that town of Kahun. She wrote, "It is apparent that the Asiatics were present in the town in some numbers, and this may have reflected the situation elsewhere in Egypt. Their exact homeland in Syria or Palestine cannot be determined. The reason for their presence remains unclear. A Petrie discovered wooden boxes underneath the floors of many houses at Kahun. They contained babies, sometimes buried 2 or 3 to a box and aged only a few months at death." Now, this is consistent with the decree of Pharaoh in Exodus 1:16 that all the male children were to be killed at birth. Now, Rosalie David went on further to write, "The quantity, range and type of articles of everyday use which were left behind in the houses may indeed suggest that the departure was sudden and unpremeditated." Now, the evidence of this sudden departure of slaves from a walled town of slaves begs the question, how can slaves just all suddenly walk out and leave Egypt? Now, David Roll, who argues for the Exodus occurring at the end of the Middle Kingdom, or Middle Bronze Age, who ironically is an agnostic, in the excellent documentary film Patterns of Evidence, made the following comment: "You look for a collapse in Egyptian civilization, and that is where you'll find Moses and the Exodus." Now, with that in mind, I present the IPUWER papyrus that's housed at the Leiden Museum in Holland. Now, this document is dated to the 13th dynasty and bears a most eerie similarity to the biblical record of the plagues of Egypt. Now, here are a few extracts from it. "Plague stalks through the land and blood is everywhere. Nay, but the river is blood. Trees are destroyed. No fruit nor herbs are found. Forsooth, gates, columns and walls are consumed by fire. The land is not light. He who places his brother in the ground is everywhere. People are stripped of clothes. Their slave takes what he can find. Gold, silver, lapis lazuli and turquoise are strung on the necks of female slaves. The stranger people from without are come into Egypt." Now, when I was in Holland, I went to actually see the IPUWER papyrus with my late and dear friend Gary Mitchelson. And there was a Dutch translation to the side of the papyrus there. So I took a photo, and without telling her where it came from, I asked Gary's girlfriend at the time, Marion, who wasn't there, to translate it and tell me what she thought it was. Now, I was very gratified when she said that she thought it sounded just like the plagues of Egypt. Now, one critic of this document, being a true historical record, stated that it was fictional because it was contradictory, giving the example that in one place it says that the land is in great want, while at the same time female slaves have become rich. Now, ironically, this specific detail is one of the best proofs linking it with the time of the Exodus, as the Bible tells us that just before the last plague, the Israelites took their spoil from the Egyptians before leaving Egypt. The Egyptian priest Manetho recorded that in the reign of a 13th dynasty king, God smote the Egyptians, and foreigners called the Hyksos took over Egypt for hundreds of years, who invaded the country without difficulty or even a battle. Now, it seems that they took advantage of the utter destruction and conquered Egypt as Israel left it. He said that they destroyed their temples and cities and slew the men and made slaves of their wives and children, ruling in a barbarous manner. Now, Hyksos is a compound form of Hak-Shus, meaning king of the Arabs or shepherd kings. Now, there's good evidence to indicate that these Hyksos were the cruel Amalekites who Israel met on their way out from Egypt. Now, Josephus identifies the Amalekites that Saul defeated a few centuries later as ruling from Pelusium in Egypt to Arabia. Now, around the same time as the disaster recorded in the IPUWER papyrus, sites all over the land of Israel were destroyed, including Jericho. Kathleen Kenyon, in her report on Jericho's Middle Bronze Age destruction, show that the lower of the two walls collapsed, providing a rampart up to the city, and that the city was burned with fire, just as the Bible records. The city was then burned according to Joshua 6:24, and everything in it. And this is exactly what is found in the archaeological record. A collapse of the walls, followed by the city being burnt, leaving a layer of ash, and then an erosion layer, after which the city was abandoned for quite some time. Now, they found storage jars all around the city that were mostly full. Now, this tells us three things. Firstly, it indicates a quick attack and not a long siege, which is unusual given how impressive its double walls were. Second, it was near harvest time, and the Bible places the event around the time of the barley harvest. And thirdly, it was not spoiled by its attackers, which again agrees with the biblical account. Now, there was also a small part of the wall that wasn't destroyed, and this matches the biblical record of Rahab, who lived along the city wall being protected. So by placing the Exodus at the end of the Middle Kingdom near the end of the Middle Bronze Age, the correct timing is restored for the conquest of the land of Canaan as demanded by the archaeology, which records the destruction of cities all over the land of Israel at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, including Jericho. Now, this evidence of archaeology, when correctly interpreted, is truly showing that the Exodus is not a myth and was in fact a historical reality, just as the Bible has said all along. Now, I'd like to play you a short extract from the documentary film Patterns of Evidence that will help you sort of summarise everything that we've looked at so far.
For many years, I was intimidated by the giant of Egypt's dating. But what made me take a second look was when I learned that it's been necessary to insert gaps into the histories of all the surrounding civilizations in order to match the dating of Egypt's third dark period. Yet the archaeology of these cultures does not seem to support such gaps. Something was wrong.
What might history look like if the dark periods were adjusted the way that some scholars believe the evidence demands?
What's not changing is the Bible timeline, because that's not affected by it. If you're changing the Egyptian timeline, you're moving it against the Bible timeline. So all of a sudden, things that were not in the right time period between the two are suddenly lining up in a different way. And that's the exciting bit, because that's when we suddenly start to find evidence for the biblical story.
It's startling to think how significant this could be, because chronology, the dates assigned to these events, is the thing being used to convince the world that the Bible is just a fairy tale. But look at the pattern. Evidence matching Joseph and the early Israelites' arrival in Egypt, their tremendous multiplication, their descent into slavery, the judgment and collapse of Egypt, the deliverance and exodus of the Semitic population, and finally in Canaan, evidence matching the conquest of the Promised Land. I know there's a lot of disagreement over the dating, but what strikes me is that if you put all the dates to the side for a moment, what emerges from the archaeology is this pattern that matches the Bible every step of the way. And doesn't that deserve to be taken seriously?
That's a terrific documentary, so I certainly highly recommend that if you just get the chance to see it at some stage. Now, by placing the Exodus at the time of the Late Bronze Age, there are further problems created in the timeline that create a conundrum in interpreting the archaeology of Israel. Now, by placing the Exodus at the time of the Late Bronze Age, by necessity, scholars have to place the time of Solomon and his great empire during the early Iron Age. Now, archaeologists have long noted that finds in Israel show great prosperity during the Late Bronze Age and significant poverty during the early Iron Age. Now, the destruction level between the Late Bronze and the early Iron Age is interpreted as being the poorer Israelites displacing the richer Canaanites. Now, by placing the Late Bronze Age around the time of Solomon, far better archaeological evidence is able to be matched up with the Bible's view of Solomon's reign being one of great prosperity, such as the wealth shown on Thutmose III's relief that we looked at before, and the Late Bronze Age gate and palace at Megiddo. Now, inside the palace at Megiddo was found a hoard of treasures which are usually attributed as being Canaanite, but with the revised chronology would be Israelite. Now, after comparing the different revised chronologies, I personally believe that the end of the Late Bronze Age period was around 750 BC. Now, just before the prosperous reigns of Uzziah and Jeroboam II, when Israel expanded greatly. Now, from 750 BC, in addition to Uzziah's great earthquake, the Assyrians took the tribes east of the Jordan into exile, and the land plunged into a much poorer state, as is reflected in the Iron Age pottery finds. Now, there's been a rather persistent myth that has continued to be perpetuated that the slavery of the Israelites lasted some 400 years. Now, this is based on a misunderstanding of Exodus 12:40 that says that the sojourning of Israel was 430 years. Now, notice carefully the word is sojourning, not the word slavery. Now, Paul in Galatians 3:16-17 says that from Abraham, when the promises were made to Mount Sinai and the giving of the law, was the same period of time, that 430 years mentioned in Exodus 12. Now, Josephus further explains that the 430 years was from when Abraham came into Canaan till the Exodus, and that from Jacob moving to Egypt till the Exodus was exactly half that period, 215 years. Now, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, clarifies the correct sense of Exodus 12:40 by translating it this way. It says, "The sojourning of the children and of their fathers, which they sojourned in the land of Canaan and in the land of Israel, was 430 years." Now, from that second block of 215 years in Egypt, you have to further subtract the remaining 71 years of Joseph's life after his father moved to Egypt, as the slavery did not begin until after Joseph died. Now, Moses, who was 80 at the time of the Exodus, was born in slavery, so the slavery was probably around about only 100 years. Now, on the night of Nisan 15, following the Passover and the death of the firstborn, we read in Exodus 12, verses 41-42. "And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the self-same day it came to pass, that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt." Now, there are a couple of interesting things to note in this passage. Paul talks about there being 430 years from the promises to Abraham and the giving of the law in Galatians 3. The same 430 years being spoken of here. So it appears that the Exodus took place 430 years to the day that Abraham left the Chaldean region. And the other thing to note is that they celebrated this Sabbath, special Sabbath, after the first Passover by hours of walking at night out of Egypt, which is not something you usually associate with a Sabbath. Now, when Moses and Aaron first approached Pharaoh in Exodus 5, they told him, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the desert and sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. Now where was this place in the wilderness, and what was this feast day? Now John Kaiser, in his article, The Great Ash Heap in the Wilderness, tells us about a site that was already prepared at the time Moses spoke with the Pharaoh. He writes, "Somewhere within 3 days' march from the border of Egypt was a place already prepared for them. Where could this be?" Now, according to Sir Charles Marston, Sir Flinders Petrie has suggested that the 3 days' journey into the wilderness was an expression used to denote the route to the Temple of Serebet in the centre of the Sinai Peninsula, where the then existing ceremonies and ritual of the Hebrews were observed. Yes, this is where the Israelites under Moses and guided by God were heading. This was the only place within 3 days' journey where facilities were in place for the Israelites to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings to God on the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, not only that, but the location of the mining camps in Sinai were well known to the Israelites. Many of them had toiled there under the pharaohs of the 12th dynasty. Sir Charles, Sir Charles continues. Sir Charles continues, "This sanctuary is at the top of a hill bare of vegetation. Its immense heap of wood ashes, 50 tons of ashes, testify to the number of its burnt offerings. They are the more remarkable because the wood must have been carried up 1,000 feet. End of quote. Now, near this location were also found inscriptions with a script that is called the PROTO-SINAITIC script. Now, it bears a certain similarity to both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hebrew, but there are far too few symbols to have been a picture language like hieroglyphics. And it appears to be perhaps the oldest alphabet in existence, predating the Greek alphabet by some 700 years. Now, this script will be focused on in the new Patterns of Evidence documentary that's just been screened in America called The Moses Controversy, which covers whether Moses could have written the Torah hundreds of years before the first evidence of the Hebrew language. Now, we spoke about Kahun before, down near the Fayoum lake in a bit further south of Cairo. Now, it's likely that the Israelites who were at that location were caught up with the rest of the Israelites at the Temple of Serebet, which was known to the Israelites from the Middle Kingdom mining operations that went on near it. Now, the traditional view of the route of the Exodus is that the crossing of the Red Sea took place at the top of the Gulf of Suez, which may have extended much further north at the time, and that Mount Sinai is located near St. Catherine's Monastery in the mountains to the south of the centre of the Sinai Peninsula. Now, some secular historians claim that the Red Sea crossing took place across Lake Serbonus near the Mediterranean coast, interpreting Red Sea as Reed Sea, but Exodus 13:17 states that they weren't to go by the northern coast road known as the Way of the Land of the Philistines. Now, in Galatians 4 verse 25, Paul writes, "For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia." Now, we have another clear clue that puts Mount Sinai in a different location than on the Sinai Peninsula itself. Now, when Moses fled from the Pharaoh, he fled to the land of Midian, according to Exodus 2 verse 15. Now, there is universal agreement that Midian is in northwest Saudi Arabia. Now, while he was there in Midian tending sheep, God appeared to him and said, "When you have brought forth the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God upon this mountain," there in Midian. Now, that Mount Sinai is in Midian in northwest Arabia to the east of the Sinai Peninsula, opens up the possibility that the Red Sea crossing may not have been across the top of the Gulf of Suez, but perhaps across the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, the most important geographical clue that conflicts with the traditional view is how the Israelites were boxed in by the mountains at the place where they crossed the Red Sea. Now, there is nowhere near the Bitter Lakes where they would be boxed in by mountains if the top of the Gulf of Suez extended much further north at the time. Now, they also went through the wilderness before reaching the Red Sea, according to Judges 11 verse 16. Now, this appears to rule out the Bitter Lakes or Sea of Reeds theory, as there is no wilderness between Goshen and the Bitter Lakes. Now there are mountains just to the south of the top of today's Gulf of Suez, so they potentially could be a match for being shut in for the wilderness at that spot. That said, Exodus 14 verse 11 says that they were out of Egypt before crossing the Red Sea, which doesn't appear to fit in with a Gulf of Suez crossing. Now the Sinai at this particular time was still a part of Egypt, and they felt a sense of security after crossing the Red Sea. Now there are two theories about the location of the Red Sea crossing that focus on the Gulf of Aqaba. Now one theory I've heard advocated in a book called Gold of the Exodus, and also supported by Bob Kanuki in his documentary about the true location of Mount Sinai, places the crossing at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba at the Straits of Tiran. Now the other theory places the crossing point midway along the Gulf, where there's this enormous beach called Nuweiba. Now this theory was originally advocated by Ron White and further promoted by Leonard Muller in his documentary The Exodus Revealed. Now the crossing at the Straits of Tiran is 18 kilometres long and has a natural underwater land bridge just over 200 metres deep that provides for an 800 metre wide pathway the full distance of the crossing. Now parts of the strait to the north of the islands are shallow with large areas of coral. Now stripped of water, the seafloor has jagged coral in places, and this large amount of coral and the very steep angle down into this crossing point are the main weaknesses for the Straits of Tiran viewpoint. On the plus side, there do seem to be good candidates for Mara and Elam going north from the Straits of Tiran. Now, if the Nuweiba Beach viewpoint is correct, after leaving Serebet El Kadim, they continued on the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and instead of continuing on that road towards the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, they made a right-hand turn to the southeast off the road, and they entered the long and windy Wadi Watir, which goes all the way through the mountains to finally make its end at the massive beach at Nuweiba. Now they were told to camp between Migdol, meaning tower, and Pi-Hahiroth, which some people believe means mouth of the gorges. Now the interpretation of that name, Pi-Hahiroth, better fits the Nuweiba Beach viewpoint. Now there is evidence of sentry posts at the top of the mountains that flank this Wadi Watir, and if Nuweiba is the correct crossing point, Egyptian soldiers could potentially have relayed a message back to the pharaoh via a signalling system that they had entered the wadi and would be trapped. Now this enormous beach is boxed in by the mountains to its north and its south, and another interesting thing to note here in the bottom right photo, which suggests that the name of the Gulf of Aqaba means the Gulf of Jacob, who was known as Israel, further adding to the view that this was where Israel crossed the Red Sea. Now the full name of Nuweiba on this map that I found online is Nuweiba El Mazayana, and it means the waters of Moses opening, which also gives further support for this location. Now, one discovery made on this beach was a memorial pillar without any inscriptions. Now, according to Ron White, when he was in Saudi Arabia, there was a second pillar found on the opposite side with the following words in Phoenician letters: Mitzrayim, Egypt; Solomon, Edom; Death, Pharaoh, Moses, Yahweh. Now, I've not heard of anyone else being able to verify that second memorial pillar. Now, diving excursions along this proposed crossing site have uncovered coral-encrusted objects that appear in the shape of chariot wheels. Now, the one on the left is from the Nuweiba beach side, and the ones on the right and bottom were independently found on the other side. Now, of special interest is a very fragile gilded chariot wheel that has the same colour of electrum, a mixture of gold and silver, which was common in Egypt. Now, these different photos appear to show the same wheel and coral, but from different angles. Now, after their original claim discovery by Ron White, they have not been refound by his sons who are with him on the original diving excursion. Now, if this object could be independently verified, might this perhaps have been a remnant of the pharaoh's very own chariot? makes you wonder. And there have also been human and horse bones found at the Nueva beach crossing, according to Leonard Mollett. Now, in Leonard Mollett's documentary, The Exodus Revealed, he shows underwater footage of how gentle the gradient is and how sandy and suitable it would be to walk across the Nueva crossing site when stripped of water. Now, Ron White claimed that there was an underwater land bridge at Nueva and that the depth of the Nueva crossing was only 240 metres, but this was due to the limits of sonar equipment. More accurate equipment used on official depth measuring excursions has shown that the depth of this crossing site is actually closer to 800 metres. Now, to put that in perspective, that depth, if it were a building that rested on the bottom, is the height of a 200-storey building. Now, theoretically, for those who do believe that there is a God who can perform miracles, he could have temporarily created the remainder of the crossing site to continue at the same gradient at which it starts from either side. Now, no natural phenomena could possibly hope to make the crossing site possible at this site for those who don't believe in God. That said, it is the only site so far which appears to have any possible artefacts supporting it as a crossing site. Now, there are a couple of other points to note about the Red Sea crossing. In Exodus 15 verse 8 we read, "And with the blast of your nostrils the waters were gathered up, the flood stood upright as a heap, and the depths were congealed in the heart of the sea." Now, other translations render congealed as curdled like cheese, or the walls of the sea became solid as if frozen like ice. Now, with 2 million Israelites crossing, it would have likely been much wider than what we see in the movie The Ten Commandments. It was probably about 1 to 2 kilometres wide to allow them all to cross the 15 kilometres. Now, a normal walking pace of 4 kilometres an hour would probably take about 4 hours to cross. Now, Exodus 14:20 says that the crossing took place all night and that the pillar lit up the night unto Israel, and that all that night the one side never came near the other. So Cecil B. DeMille did get that part right, that the Red Sea crossing did occur at night time. You can almost hear Charlton Heston's as Moses saying, "Behold his mighty hand." Now, I still can't believe, with all the amazing computer graphics we have in movies these days, that no one 60 years later has improved on the Red Sea crossing in the Ten Commandments movie. I was so disappointed with the movie Exodus, Gods and Kings, which watered down the Red Sea crossing to having just the tide go out. Unbelievable. Seriously, people with no respect for the Bible should not be making Bible movies. Now, this next artefact could be the greatest example in archaeology of something that is hidden in plain sight. It is one of the Mycenae funeral stela, or an ancient tombstone, that was found at the site famous as the city that King Agamemnon of the Trojan War came from. Now, this stela is actually the very first thing that you see when you enter the main museum at Athens. Now, I was especially interested to take this photo of it, as Simca Jakovici, in his documentary The Exodus Decoded, makes a case that the tombstone shows a visual representation of the Red Sea crossing. So it's got 3 panels, as you can see here. The top and bottom panels have swirling symbols, possibly indicating water, and in the middle panel are 2 characters facing off against each other. Now, the museum curators, not making any connection, have written the following in their description of the artefact to the side of it. They write, "The upper and lower panels are filled with spirals, while the central panel has a chariot pulled by a galloping horse and driven by a standing charioteer. In front of the horse is a second male figure that appears to be attacking the chariot with a spear held in his raised right hand." Now, is this a graphical representation of the Red Sea crossing hidden in plain sight? You be the judge. Now, it should be noted that many scholars believe that the Danoi, who migrated to Greece, were in fact descended from the tribe of Dan. Now, after crossing the Red Sea, the Israelites went to the bitter waters of Marah, and then to the oasis of Elim, through the wilderness of Sin, where God sent the manna, and finally, after going to Rephidim, where the rock of Horeb was, they reached Mount Sinai. Now, the mountain with the strongest traditional links to being Mount Sinai in Arabia is Jabal el-Lawz. It's got a blackened peak and a large plain in front of it. Now, the name Jabal el-Lawz is very interesting, as it means the mountain of the laws, implying the mountain where God gave the Ten Commandments. Now, that blackened peak on this mountain is unique to this area. It's only on the surface of the rocks, with pink granite visible underneath the black discoloration. The rock has been metamorphosed, obviously by great heat. Now, in Exodus 19:18, it says that Mount Sinai was on fire when God descended upon it. Also, at regular intervals on the eastern side of the mountain are these piles of stone which appear to be boundary markers, which fits the detail of Moses setting limits so no one would set foot on the mountain of God. Nearby, there's also this cave which fits the story of Elijah's flight to Horeb and staying in a cave where God spoke to him in a still small voice. Now, on the on the opposite side of the mountain, or on its western side, is this absolutely extraordinary rock that is split in two and has clear evidence of strong water erosion at its base. It's like a water geyser from below just gushed upwards with tremendous force and split the rock. To me, this seems like amazing proof of what it says in the Bible really did happen there. This rock of Horeb is on the western side of Jabal el-Lawz, and this is identified in the Bible as Rephidim. It was at Rephidim that the Israelites had to fight off the Amalekites. Now, after their time at Mount Sinai, they gradually made their way north from Arabia to Ezion-Geber, where Eilat is today at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, and then went on to Kadesh Barnea. Now, it was from Kadesh Barnea that the spies journeyed into the land and came back. Now, when they murmured yet again against God, he decreed that instead of entering the land within months of leaving Egypt, they would wander 40 years before God would let the next generation in. Now, Kadesh means holy, and Barnea is thought to mean place of wandering. Now, it's usually placed at El Kadirat in the middle of the Negev. Now, this conflicts with where the Bible places Kadesh Barnea. Now, Kadesh Barnea was on the edge of the territory of Edom. Now, Moses sent messages to the king of Edom and said, "Behold, we're at Kadesh, a town on the edge of your territory." And in Deuteronomy 1:2, it also says that there are 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir, which is close to Petra, unto Kadesh Barnea. So if Kadesh Barnea was at Ain el Kadirat, you would not take the way of Mount Seir, the road up the Arabah Valley up past Petra. You would take the northwest road away from the Arabah Valley after reaching Ezion-Geber. Now, when they got news back from the king of Edom that he declined their request to go through their land by the king's highway, they had to head back south of Kadesh Barnea around the southern edge of Edom's territory. Now, on the opposite side of the mountains to the east of the Arabah Valley was the king's highway, and the way of the wilderness then branches off east from it around the territory of Edom and Moab. They then crossed the valley over the Arnon River, which is like the Grand Canyon, quite spectacular in places, and then went to Mount Nebo. Now, here's a map showing my best estimate of the entire route of the Exodus that the Israelites took to get to the Promised Land. Now, I cannot categorically rule out a Red Sea crossing at the top of the Gulf of Suez. However, if they crossed the top of the Gulf of Suez and went to Mount Sinai and Midian, they would have gone through Ezion-Geber to get there and passed on the way back up to the Promised Land. Now, the Bible only records them going to Ezion-Geber only once after going to Mount Sinai, hence why I feel that the Nuweiba location is the more likely crossing point through the Red Sea. Now, they defeated Sihon, king of the Amorites, who controlled the territories east of the Jordan that would later go to Reuben and Gad. And with Moses' help, they also defeated the giant Og, king of Bashan, which is today's Golan Heights, east of the Sea of Galilee. Now, technically, Moses did get to go to the Promised Land. He just wasn't allowed to cross to the land west of the Jordan River. Now, there was an amazing discovery that was made at an Amorite site on the east side of the Jordan called Tel Dir Allah. Now, some inscriptions were found on a plaster wall which read, "Warnings given by Balaam, the son of Beor, a seer of the gods." Now, this was the same Balaam, son of Beor, according to the book of Numbers, who was hired to bring a curse on Israel, and he also had a talking donkey, the original Mr. Ed. Now, under Joshua, they then crossed the Jordan River and conquered Jericho before continuing the conquest of the Promised Land. Now, another amazing discovery has recently been made at Gilgal on the eastern side of Jericho, the first place that they camped after crossing the Jordan River. Now, there's a double stone engine surrounds the site, which from above has the appearance of a shoe, and a rectangular section within it has the same measurements of the tabernacle. Now, the significance of the shoe shape is seen in Joshua 1 verse 3, which says, "Every place on which the sole of your feet treads, I have given you." As if they were making a statement, staking their claim to the land. Now, if you remember, in the book of Ruth, there was a relative closer to her first husband who had died than Boaz, who could be a redeemer for Ruth. Now, he rejected the offer of redeeming the land inheritance and marrying Ruth, and handed over a sandal to signify this. Now, you may have wondered, what has handing over a shoe got to do with that? It's like the opposite of Cinderella. He gives a shoe to signify that he doesn't want to marry her. Well, the custom also comes from Joshua 1 verse 3. Giving the shoe in this custom signified the transference of the land inheritance. Now, the site of Shiloh, not far in the central mountains close to Shechem, was where the tabernacle was during the time of the judges. Now, there are remnants today of a walled enclosure about 50 metres by 25 metres, which is the size of the courtyard of the tabernacle. And see in the second picture there are even holes for tent poles. Now, Israeli archaeologist and well-known Bible critic Israel Finkelstein wrote the following about Shiloh. He wrote, "Shiloh was first occupied in the period that archaeologists call Middle Bronze Age 2B. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Middle Bronze Age finds is that already in this period there appears to have been a shrine at the site. Shiloh thus joins several other sacred Israelite places where a cultic tradition had existed continuously ever since the Middle Bronze Age, long before the Israelite settlement in the 12th to 11th centuries BC. Well, if Israel left Egypt during the Middle Bronze Age, then it would have been Israel who first occupied the site." Now, northern Israel, at the city of Hatzor, it also has the same great burn layer at the end of the Middle Bronze Age period as Jericho. And what was even more astonishing was that there was found a tablet noting the name of its king. Now, according to David Roll, the name on the tablet for the king after it is transliterated is Jabin, who the Bible says was the name of the king of Hatzor in Joshua's time. Now, in Numbers 34, the boundaries of the land of Israel are given, though they didn't control the full extent of it until the time of David and Solomon. Now, the northern boundary was to go from the sea across to Hamath in central Syria, and then downwards, including Lebanon and southern Syria. The southern boundary was formed by the Wadi El Arish. That wadi, not the Nile, is the river or brook of Egypt. Now, other descendants of Abraham, such as Edom, also had their inheritance, and the rest of the Arabian Peninsula between the Euphrates and Egypt was for Ishmael. And even Lot's sons, Ammon and Moab, were decreed an inheritance, even though they were only related to and not actually descended from Abraham. Now, after the years of conquest, the Israelites met at Shechem to do what Moses told them to do in the blessings and cursings chapter of Deuteronomy 28. In what would have been a profound and dramatic scene, half the tribes were to stand on Mount Gerizim to recite the blessings, and the other half were to stand on Mount Ebal to recite the curses and to reconfirm their covenant with God. Now, the acoustics in this natural amphitheatre between the two mountains is quite remarkable, according to one archaeologist who says he could clearly hear his friend shout from the other mountain. Now Shechem, in between the two mountains, was where Abraham first built an altar in the land of Canaan, as did Jacob when he brought his wives and family back from Padan Aram, and had his clan put away all their idols and rededicated himself and his whole household to God, much like we do at Passover each year. Here, the Israelites reconfirmed their covenant with God and erected a covenant stone on the site, which appears has been found by archaeologist Ernest Sellen. It was re-erected in front of the remains of a temple that was destroyed by fire in the Middle Bronze Age, according to archaeology. Now, by placing the Exodus late in the Middle Bronze Age, this matches perfectly with the Bible, where in Judges chapter 9 we read how Gideon's wicked son Abimelech later attacked the city of Shechem and burnt the temple of Baal-berith, meaning Lord of the Covenant, to the ground. So that ended the journey of Israel into the Promised Land. Now, I had originally prepared more to share with you today, but unfortunately time doesn't allow me to go into any of that for today. Now, in conclusion, for those who have eyes to see, there is much solid archaeological proof that supports the Bible story of the Exodus and the journey to the Promised Land. Now, just as God was faithful to bring his people Israel into the Promised Land, he will also be faithful to us in our journey as we strive to overcome sin and endure to the end. If we are faithful to God and don't have a heart of unbelief, as Paul warned about in Hebrews 3 and 4, he will bring us into the promised land of his coming kingdom. As Mr. Breville would say, thanks for coming.